Teddy Roosevelt was a force of nature. He was the colonel who led the legendary charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, the president who earned the title Trustbuster, and the statesman who counseled his nation to speak softly and carry a big stick. On the night he died, a close friend remarked that death had no choice but to take him in his sleep, for had Roosevelt been awake, he would have put up a fight. That was the kind of man he was. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, possessed boundless energy and deep conviction. His personal magnetism was so overwhelming that a rival politician once complained, "When he is in the neighborhood, the public can no more turn away than a small boy can turn from a circus parade." To the American people, he embodied strength and vitality. Yet remarkably, Theodore Roosevelt entered the world as a frail and sickly child. New York City, 1863. In a handsome townhouse that felt like a gift to 5-year-old Teddy Roosevelt, the young boy sat crippled by severe asthma, wistfully watching healthy children, free, active, and strong, from a distance. Despite his physical limitations, young Teddy was captivated by stories of the Civil War raging in the South. To be a soldier, he believed, was to be a real man. His mother was a gentle and refined woman who adored her delicate son. But his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a prominent attorney, was firmly resolved that his boy would not be pampered. "You must make your body," he told Teddy plainly. "It is hard drudgery, but I know you will do it." The young Roosevelt took those words to heart, and by the time he entered Harvard University, he had transformed himself into a vigorous and physically capable young man with a deep love of sport and rugged outdoor living. "By Jove," he wrote at the time, "I enjoy every moment I live." At Harvard, Teddy also found companionship in Alice Lee, a beautiful Boston debutante, and the two married shortly after his graduation. Their future appeared bright. They had social standing, and a trust fund provided Teddy with a steady income. But he shocked his aristocratic circle by pursuing what they considered an undignified profession: politics. Elected as a Republican to the New York State Legislature, he immediately astonished colleagues by boldly attacking the powerful and corrupt Tammany Hall political machine. Then grief struck with brutal swiftness. His mother succumbed to typhoid fever, and just 4 hours later, his beloved wife Alice died in childbirth. Devastated, Teddy sought escape. He purchased a ranch in North Dakota and immersed himself in the demanding and unforgiving life of a cowhand. He deliberately sought out hardship and danger, and in doing so realized a childhood dream. He became a seasoned and hardened adventurer. Returning east, Teddy remarried in 1886. His new bride was Edith Caro, a childhood friend. He resumed his political career, receiving an appointment in Washington, D.C. as Civil Service Commissioner. Even in that relatively minor post, his bold and aggressive approach made him the talk of the capital. After a few years, he moved on to a role that suited his crusading temperament even better: Police Commissioner of New York City, where he threw himself enthusiastically into the battle against corruption. Yet even that was not enough. He was restless and hungry for a greater challenge. In 1897, he secured a position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley's administration. Then, on February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, igniting a wave of national outrage against Spain. McKinley declared war, and Roosevelt seized the moment he had long been waiting for. He organized a volunteer regiment unlike any other, an unlikely assembly of cowboys and gamblers from the West alongside polo-playing Harvard graduates from the East. They called themselves Roosevelt's Rough Riders. They were amateur soldiers, but their enthusiasm was extraordinary, and their newly commissioned lieutenant colonel was the most fervent of them all. Teddy cut through bureaucratic obstacles to get his men to Cuba, terrified that the war might end before he could see any action. Finally, on July 1, 1898, his moment came. At the head of his troops, he led a charge up San Juan Hill. "I waved my hat," he later recalled, "and up the hill we went." Roosevelt and his Rough Riders emerged from the conflict as its most celebrated heroes. His fame and popularity surged, propelling him into a race for governor of New York, where he was presented to voters as the man capable of cleaning up a scandal-ridden state government. After a grueling campaign, he won. He was 42 years old, yet carried himself with the vigor and enthusiasm of a much younger man. Teddy cherished his role as the head of a lively and energetic household. He was a devoted and warm-hearted father, full of humor and affection. "I have the happiest home life of any man I have ever known," he proudly declared. But within Republican Party circles, forces were already conspiring against him. To the party establishment, he was too unpredictable, too rebellious, and too independent to be trusted in high office. The party bosses made their move at the Republican convention in 1900. Against his own wishes, they nominated Teddy for the position of vice president on the McKinley ticket, an impressive-sounding but traditionally powerless role designed to sideline him. The Republicans won the election with ease, and Roosevelt was effectively shelved. One of his most bitter adversaries, political boss Mark Hanna, voiced his unease nonetheless. "There is only one life between this madman and the White House," he warned. His concern proved prophetic. On September 6, 1901, President McKinley attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, and an assassin struck. A week later, President William McKinley was dead. The man who had been maneuvered into the vice presidency precisely to curtail his ambitions now inherited the highest office in the nation. Initially, Roosevelt was visibly shaken by the weight of his new responsibilities. He pledged to proceed cautiously and to uphold McKinley's conservative policies. Several newspapers celebrated what appeared to be a change of character. "He is an entirely different man today," one publication noted hopefully. But the transformation was short-lived. In May of 1902, approximately 147,000 coal miners launched a strike in eastern Pennsylvania, and the mine operators flatly refused to enter into any negotiations with the workers, and Roosevelt would soon make clear that the era of hands-off government was over. The mine operators were determined to crush the Union, and the strike dragged on for 6 grueling months. With winter approaching, schools and hospitals were left without heat, and the coal shortage escalated into a national emergency. Teddy abandoned his earlier pledge of restraint, stunning conservatives by threatening to deploy the army to operate the mines directly. The strike was settled, marking the first time in American history that a president had personally intervened to break a deadlock between industry and labor. 1904 brought both an election year and a period of personal crisis for Roosevelt. To secure re-election, he knew he had to take his message straight to the people. He embarked on an exhausting nationwide speaking tour, delivering speech after speech to anyone who would listen. America's standing in the world was a central theme. He acknowledged the nation's growing strength, but cautioned that the United States was still regarded as a minor power on the global stage. "We are a great people," he declared, "and we must play a great part in the world. All we can decide is whether we shall play it well or ill." Yet on the eve of the election, Roosevelt was gripped by doubt. The enormous crowds that had turned out for his rousing speeches seemed more curious than genuinely inspired, and he became privately convinced that the American people were about to consign him to political obscurity. He could not have been more wrong. Washington, D.C., 1905, a large and jubilant crowd gathered to cheer Theodore Roosevelt back into office, returned by a landslide. "I had no conception that such a thing was possible," he confessed. "At last I am no longer a political accident." Emboldened and assured, Roosevelt thrust the nation into the arena of international affairs. He boldly offered himself as a mediator in the Russo-Japanese War, and in August 1905, diplomats from both nations convened at Portsmouth, New Hampshire at his invitation. An agreement was swiftly reached, a resounding triumph for his new administration on the world stage. Riding that momentum, Roosevelt made another audacious move to demonstrate American military strength, ordering 16 warships to circumnavigate the globe on what he proudly termed a goodwill cruise. The Great White Fleet visited major ports across the world, leaving a powerful and lasting impression of America's capacity to dominate the seas. But Roosevelt's ambitions extended further still. The United States had only one fleet and 2 vast coastlines to defend, and he was determined to realize a dream that had captivated engineers for centuries, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through a canal across the narrow Isthmus of Panama. A French company had attempted the project in the 1880s, but had been brought to ruin by disease and engineering failures. The United States was now prepared to succeed where France had not. The obstacle was Colombia, which controlled Panama and refused to sell the required land at a price Roosevelt deemed acceptable. Then, quite suddenly, a revolution erupted in Panama City. As the fighting raged, American warships appeared off the Panamanian coast and withdrew only after the Colombian government had been overthrown. Within 10 days, Roosevelt had purchased from the new government a 6-mile-wide strip of land bridging the isthmus. He freely admitted that his methods had been unconventional. "If I had followed conventional methods," he explained, "Congress would still be debating. Now while the debate goes on, the canal does also." The greatest obstacle proved to be disease, requiring a massive sanitation effort before construction could begin in earnest. The Panama Canal became the largest, most costly, and most technically demanding public works project the country had ever undertaken, but it succeeded. The maritime map of the world was fundamentally redrawn, bringing New York 8,000 sea miles closer to San Francisco. The canal stood as a monument to American engineering genius and to the sheer force of Roosevelt's determination. Back in Washington, Roosevelt pressed on with his relentless campaign against the trusts. Monopolies in railroads, steel, sugar, and other essential industries had accumulated colossal economic power and operated virtually free of any regulation. Indeed, they often controlled the government itself. The United States Senate was mockingly referred to as the Millionaires' Club. Roosevelt's assault on these monopolies was direct and forceful, combining public outrage, court rulings, and the president's blistering contempt. Legal battles dragged on for years, but the era in which the presidency bent to the will of industrial tycoons was effectively over. At the conclusion of his term, Roosevelt felt honor-bound to keep a long-standing pledge not to seek re-election. Despite passionate appeals to accept the nomination, he refused. Instead, he handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, who won the election comfortably, though many regarded him as little more than Roosevelt's obedient shadow. With the political world temporarily behind him, Roosevelt set sail for Africa on an extended safari. For 11 months he roamed the wilderness, absorbed in nature, wildlife study, and hunting, content to face no diplomatic challenge greater than deciding who would take the first shot at a lion. On his way home, Europe received him with the full ceremony and dignity befitting the leader of a great nation. In Norway, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in brokering the end of the Russo-Japanese War. "I feel," he remarked with characteristic humor, "that if I met another king, I should bite him." On June 10, 1910, Roosevelt arrived back in New York to a thunderous welcome from friends and admirers. Taft, notably, was absent from the reception. For a time, Roosevelt retreated to the seclusion of his home at San Hill, but inevitably, politics drew him back in. Reports poured in from across the country that Taft was governing as a conservative and abandoning the Roosevelt tradition. Teddy accused him of being soft on big business and weak in leadership. It quickly became apparent that the two men would contest the Republican nomination in 1912. Taft responded publicly, "I do not want to fight Teddy Roosevelt, but sometimes a man in a corner fights, and I am going to fight." The Republican convention proved decisive. After a bitter struggle, Taft secured the nomination and the backing of the party's conservative wing. Roosevelt walked out, taking the liberal faction with him. In a moment of fierce anger and disappointment, he made a fateful choice. He would run as an independent. "I am as fit as a bull moose," he declared early in the campaign, and the bull moose became the emblem of his insurgent party. In the end, however, the only man who truly benefited from the contest between Roosevelt and Taft was the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. The Bull Moose Party was eventually disbanded, and Roosevelt returned to private life, exhausted and embittered by defeat. He found renewal, as he always had, in nature. Field trips and wildlife study restored something of his old spirit, and he remained a beloved public figure despite his political setbacks, a leader in the Boy Scout movement, an enthusiastic outdoorsman, and an inspiration to ordinary Americans who admired his vigor and his passion for hard work. In 1913, while traveling in South America, he learned from Brazilian officials of an uncharted jungle waterway known as the River of Doubt. The name alone had the ring of adventure. Despite warnings that such an expedition was a venture for younger men, he led a team into the desolate territory to chart it. He pushed himself relentlessly, thrilled at the prospect of testing himself against the wilderness once more, but he emerged from the jungle exhausted, with a seriously injured leg. "I had to go," he said quietly. "It was my last chance to be a boy." By 1916, war was consuming Europe and the United States was torn by fierce debate over whether to aid Britain or maintain neutrality. President Wilson, narrowly re-elected, urged the American people toward impartiality. Roosevelt threw himself into the argument, convinced that Wilson was making a catastrophic mistake. Events proved him right. On April 6, 1917, Wilson had no choice but to sign America's declaration of war. "It has come at last," said Roosevelt, and for a year he had been hammering at the nation's lack of military preparedness. Now, finally, something could be done. He went to Wilson personally and requested a combat assignment in France. The president refused. Roosevelt was furious and humiliated, convinced the rejection was politically motivated. But he could not stay removed from the great struggle for long. He launched his own campaign, a strenuous speaking tour across the nation in support of the war effort. He was a familiar presence at training camps, always eager to spend time with soldiers and to recall with pride his own moment of glory at San Juan Hill. He was deeply moved knowing that all 4 of his sons were serving in France. Then, in July 1918, just months before the war's end, his youngest son Quentin flew a sortie over German lines. His plane did not return, and the following day he was reported killed in action. When the soldiers came home, a pale and shaken Theodore Roosevelt was there to greet them. He composed a moving epitaph for his son: "Only those are fit to live who do not fear to die. Both life and death are part of the same great adventure." Roosevelt's own great adventure was drawing to a close. He spent most of his remaining time at Sagamore Hill, the old fire and exuberance quietly fading. Shortly before the end, he turned to his wife and said softly, "I wonder if you will ever know how much I love Sagamore Hill." In the early morning hours of January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died peacefully in his sleep. His passing brought an outpouring of grief from around the world. Perhaps his finest epitaph came from a distant relative, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. "We know, and the nation knows, yes, the world knows, that Theodore Roosevelt was a great patriot and a great soul. Theodore Roosevelt was never the kind of man or politician who played it safe. Time and again he risked his career for the sake of his principles, and time and again he paid a heavy price for it. But he had a personal philosophy that guided him always. 'It is better to dare mighty things and fail,' he said, 'than to live in a gray twilight where there is neither victory nor defeat.'